Welcome to the Yeoman Podcast. I'm glad to have with me this episode Zak Slayback. Zak, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Geoff. Really excited to talk about this topic.
We are going to be talking about Rerum Novarum, the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII that he's written on capital and labor. He wrote this in 1897. I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure Zak is who introduced me both to Pope Leo XIII and to his encyclicals. This is the only one I've read so far. Of note are the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV. I understand, tell me if this is right, like he has said that he chose that name in part because of Pope Leo XIII.
Yeah.
Right about
usually when a pope chooses a name, the first thing people look to is the immediate predecessor who had that name, right? So John Paul II famously took John Paul II because his predecessor was John Paul I, who died after 30 days. Mm-hmm. Francis was a little unusual in that he was the first Pope Francis. But in the case of Leo XIV, when he came out on the loggia and they announced that he was Leo XIV, of course, there's all this speculation of why would he take Leo XIV? And he quelled the speculation pretty quickly thereafter in saying one of the main reasons he took Leo XIV as his name was because Leo XIII, the author of Rerum Novarum that we're talking about today, was a pope very much concerned about the effects of the introduction of new technology and the relationship between workers and capital and government and states and the church through his time as pope in the 19th century. So he's very much looking back to the Industrial Revolution under which Leo XIII was writing, with concern specifically on the effects of artificial intelligence on the worker and the economy today.
It can totally so, and we'll get into this a bit, and the relevancies to me were just completely obvious, and I'm excited to talk to Zak about this. Zak, by way of background, is a partner with a venture capital fund, and also a practicing Catholic and would it be right to say an amateur theologian?
I'm not sure about that, but I do enjoy. One of my hobbies is reading theology.
And I've always had delightful conversations with Zak, and he is definitely a student of this work. And it's especially interesting to me that the context and perspective he has working in the industry that he works in, focusing very much on new technologies. And also someone who's very interested in the moral implications of these new technologies. I'm going to start out, if I may, with a quote from Rerum Novarum, and this will kick us off in the conversation. It is one thing to have a right to the possession of money, and another to have a right to use money as one wills. Private ownership, as we've seen, is the natural right of man, and to exercise that right, especially as members of society, is not only lawful, but absolutely necessary. It is lawful, says St. Thomas Aquinas, here he's quoting Aquinas, for a man to hold private property, and is also necessary for the carrying on of human existence. And then back to Leo. But if the question be asked, how must one's possessions be used? The church replies without hesitation in the words of the same holy doctor, again quoting Aquinas, man should not consider his material possessions as his own, but as common to all, so as to share them without hesitation when others are in need. So with that quote, maybe setting the tone, maybe I start my first question. Can you share with us, the context in which Leo is writing this?
Sure. So Pope Leo XIII is Pope in the late half of the 19th century. He's Pope for several decades, one of the longest reigning popes in history. And in that time, there's a lot going on in the world. Politically, you really have the rise of nationalism throughout Europe. You have the collapse of the remaining kingdoms, the remaining empires, and particularly he's living through the rise of The nation of Italy is one of these things that's particularly relevant to the Pope in particular, but we also have the French Republic and a bunch of other things going on in Europe. You have obviously the Industrial Revolution, which is something he's extremely concerned about. The effect that the Industrial Revolution has on workers, the relationship between workers and capital, the relationship between workers, capital, and the state, because we also have the rise of state socialism at the same time, as well as like this kind of idea of Gilded Age capitalism that we might think about attached to the Industrial Revolution. And then within the church even, he is the first pope after the First Vatican Council. And the First Vatican Council is a collection of all the bishops coming together to define certain things about the faith. And one of the things that they end up defining is this idea of papal infallibility. When is the Pope infallible? Now, that's a theological concept that is not directly relevant to this document per se, but it does provide the opportunity for the Pope to publish these documents that we call encyclicals that are sent to all the bishops of the world. And we find in some of the later encyclicals are actually addressed to all men and women of good faith that are teaching documents. And those teaching documents contain anything from social issues like we're talking about here. This is considered like the inflection point or the kicking off point of what we call Catholic social teaching, contemporary Catholic social teaching, as well as, more theological concepts, right? So there are later papal encyclicals on things like the Immaculate Conception, related to like the Blessed Virgin Mary. So he ends up writing something like 80 plus encyclicals in his years. Most of them are on the shorter side, very targeted to very specific issues. For example, he's got a document called Immortale Dei that talks about where does political power come from, that's responding to both the rise of nationalism as well as the rise of liberalism, this idea of like the power comes purely from the consent of the governed. He's got a document on the duties of Christian citizens. He's got a document on the United States. He's got a document on something called Americanism. The idea of like negative liberty as well. He's got a document called Libertas on that. Rerum Novarum, though, is typically the document that is largely associated with him, particularly on the social teaching topic. And he's really trying to say that it is not appropriate for a Christian society or even a post-Christian society, because he's really speaking in terms of terms that would be understood by many people also outside of the church to embrace socialism, but it's also not appropriate for those societies to embrace capitalism in this Gilded Age sense that we see very relevant in 1891.
I haven't yet, but I mean, you just running through that list of things he's written about. I mean, like, God, every single one of those topics is super fascinating to me and seems very relevant today. Also, I hadn't in our chat before we started recording, we hadn't talked about nationalism. We'd really talked about a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, and it does. Can you share a little bit more context about when you say the rise of nationalism? When I talk to people about this topic, most don't really appreciate that. In the early 1700s. The difference between how people thought about their loyalty to place or where they were from changed dramatically from the early 1700s to the early 1900s. And Leo was living through this in a big way, particularly in Italy. Can you share a little bit of the context for that too?
Yeah. So Leo comes to power in the mid-19th century. He's elected after he's elected after the First Vatican Council. An interesting fact here actually is because of the attack of the Italian nationalists on Rome, the First Vatican Council didn't actually formally close. So the bishops are there. The papal states come under attack, and the Italian nationalists end up winning. And that's where we get this idea of like Vatican City State, right? Mm-hmm. So prior to the rise of nationalist Italy, you had most of the region around Rome was actually a monarchy under the temporal rule of the Pope. So the Pope had both a temporal power in the sense that he was a political leader of a polity that was a city-state around the city of Rome, as well as spiritual power as the head of the Catholic Church, the head bishop in a sense. So we see Italy really unifies. At a certain point, the
it's in the 1860s, right? Is that about
that sounds right? That it was in the mid 1800s. This would have been
Italian listeners. Forgive us if we don't have that.
Well, so his predecessor was Pius IX, and Pius IX was the prisoner in the Vatican because the Italian nationalists end up sieging the city, and he refuses to leave the city while it's under siege. And it's not until you get the Lateran Treaty, which comes later, that you really get the acknowledgement of Vatican City as its own city-state. Otherwise, really you could think of the papacy as under siege by the Italian nationalists at this point. So you have Pius IX. He is the Pope who oversees the First Vatican Council. He dies. Leo XIII is elected. He rules until the very late 19th century, and then the election of Pius X. And then until you get John the 20, you have Benedict XV in there, but you have Pius X, Benedict XV, Pius XI, XII, John the 23rd. We're getting into like mid 20th century at that point. But yeah, in Italy in particular, you see the rise of a secular nationalist polity that is pulling together all these kingdoms and city-states that had existed for hundreds of years and pulling them under one banner of Italy as a thing that wouldn't really have been a relevant concept in people's minds at this point. This is also, of course, when we see this huge influx of Italian immigrants to the United States. So a lot of the Italian immigrants to the United States.
The same thing is happening in the United States at this time, following this war, where someone who lived in Venice would have very much identified themselves as a Venetian in 1830. But 70 years later, they would have been a Venetian, but they would have been an Italian.
They would have been an Italian, right? And
similar in the United States, from a Georgian to an American,
right? A Pennsylvanian to an American, right? Very much this unification under centralized state power.
This was happening all over the West too, all over Europe.
We see the rise of Germany as a nation, the German Empire at this time. Leo XIII is particularly concerned with France. Of course, we have the French Revolution in 1789, so we're already under the one of the French republics at this point. But he's also very concerned with the state of France, in large part because of the large Catholic population in France. Great Britain really becomes Great Britain at this time, right? So you see this consolidation under national identities that previously would have been entirely foreign to people in the 19th century, largely in the 19th century, which of course gives rise to a lot of the colorful history we have of the 20th century.
Sure. And a thing about nationalism, which I think relates directly to and is connected to, I imagine, industrialization, is the relationship of the individual to the group that they find themselves within becomes considerably more distant, and the group becomes considerably larger. So, as you might imagine, if you're in Venice in 1830, your ruler, for lack of a better term, is probably someone you know, or at least you have seen, and that changes dramatically over the next 100 years.
Yeah, and we see Leo XIII address many of these topics, primarily in the context of speaking to the socialists, because the socialists, socialism and nationalism were very tightly intertwined at this point, right? But one of the things that I find interesting about this document, and again, all Catholic social teaching, contemporary Catholic social teaching that really comes out of it is a mistake to think of this as an ideological document. It is a mistake to think of Catholic social teaching as ideological, in the sense that it's starting with a normative proposition about the way the world ought to be and building the things around that, right? So like the normative proposition of socialism would be that man exists in terms of classes, right? And that he's going to exist in a term of conflict between those classes, and that the working class ought to be in power. Liberalism on the other side, which is what I would generally capture Gilded Age capitalism under, right? Liberalism starts with this proposition that man is an individual, right? And that he comes into the world and builds these kind of contractual relationships. You see this in its most explicit form under later in the 20th century, Murray Rothbard, who actually uses the Robinson Crusoe thought experiment of where do natural rights come from? You imagine a man on an island, he has to provide for himself, he has self-ownership, he ends up contracting with others as he interacts with them. The church says no, and Leo XIII says no, and there's a section in the document that I'll point us to here, and he says that the fundamental man is born into relationships. He is born into relationships with his family, and he's born into relationships with God. Right. So you have to start with that observation. So it's more of an anthropological project than it is an ideological project. Mm-hmm. And when you start with that, you start to see, okay, here's how the world works around that. So one of the lines in this document that I think is a consistent line you see throughout teaching on similar documents. We can talk about the history of other encyclicals that come from other popes over the next 100 years or so, specifically referring back to Rerum Novarum. But is this line in the document, this would be under paragraph 12, if anybody is following along, paragraph 12 and paragraph 13, it says, no human law can abolish the natural and original right of marriage, nor in any way limit the chief and principal purpose of marriage ordained by God's authority from the beginning, increase and multiply. Hence, we have the family, the society of man's house, a society very small, one must admit, but nonetheless a true society, and one older than any state. Consequently, it has rights and duties peculiar to itself, which are quite independent of the state. And he goes on to say one of those rights is going to be private property, because you need to be able to own property to be able to provide for your family. Mm-hmm. But you see here this fundamental proposition that before we even have a state, before we even have a nation or anything that would follow from that, we already have natural societies, and those natural societies are the family. And to your point on the distance between members of a society, one of the concepts that we see introduced in this document or outlined in this document that we see throughout Catholic social teaching is a concept of subsidiarity, that you're going to have a series of relationships, communities, and societies leading all the way up to the top to eventually like a global one. But the things typically ought to be solved at the place closest to where the problem is happening. Mm-hmm. So it's not quite localism, but it works. A product of the concept of subsidiarity is often localism. Yeah. Things ought to be solved at the local level. And this is, again, just ecclesiastically or theologically, this is how traditionally the church worked, is things are solved by the pastor and then the bishop, and things only go to the Pope when they need to go to the Pope. Mm-hmm. Popes don't sit around. And this is, I think, an important concept for anyone who's starting to look at encyclicals and try to understand, like, why does the Pope write this? Popes aren't sitting around just thinking like, what's a topic I could write about that would be interesting? Typically, by the time it gets to the Pope, it means that it needs to be spoken of from that level. Mm-hmm. But things are working their way up to the Pope. So in the case of what Leo's living through, the challenges of socialism, the challenges of nationalism, the challenges of liberalism have worked their way all the way up to Rome, where he has to say, okay, no, we need to be very clear about church teaching on this, that the family precedes the state. Man has a natural but not unlimited right to property. And that you start there, you can put socialism aside. And then when we understand that the family is the fundamental unit of society, we also see that there are going to be rights, duties, and obligations that will pop up with respect to the relationship between capital and labor and between the state and the family. So he goes on to lay out a number of different duties and obligations that employers might have to their workers, as well as that the state might have to the people living within its boundaries. So a big emphasis you find in the document, and that you'll find in later papal teaching on this topic, is the importance of productive property. The tax code, the legal code ought to be written in such a way that it makes the ownership of productive property possible for those who are working, and that those in the positions of capital, employers, provide the opportunity for their workers to acquire the means to then acquire productive property. And of course, he's largely talking about land, but we also see this developed later, for example, under the writings of John Paul II with respect to capital more broadly used.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to that, to all of what you said, particularly that point about the mutual obligations between worker and employer, or worker and capitalist. And I would like you to elaborate a bit more on 1897 is when this is published.
1891, if you 1891 actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep.
I had that wrong.
I only offer that. I'm sorry. I only offer that because the later documents a lot of them are numbered by the number of years since the original document.
Well, that makes it, I think, even more prescient. So this topic has risen to require the Pope's attention, and industrialization has been underway in a significant way in Europe, in the United States, for a great many decades by this point. It is changing the nature of one's relationship to the world and the people they work with and all these kinds of things. So could you elaborate a little bit more on like the historical landscape, right? What's going on? And I'll ask you too I'll just say my read of this is Pope Leo is seeing and quite alarmed by what he feels is the increasing likelihood of something like the Bolshevik Revolution, mm-hmm. and is very concerned about what things like that would do to humanity. So anyway, can you share more about the background of the day?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. He's seeing the rise of state socialism. He's seeing that liberalism under Pius XI, for example. He has a document in 1931 called Quadragesimo Anno that references back to Rerum Novarum. But in particular, he lays out this explanation that I think you're correctly putting your finger on, that Leo understood that unrestrained, both statism as well as unrestrained liberalism under like Gilded Age capitalism sets up the conditions for the rise of state socialism and eventually communism. And it's these disparities and the destruction of these mediating societies and mediating organizations that you would naturally have seen before the rise of nationalism and before the rise of liberalism that makes it that sets up the conditions under which you have a large mass of unhappy workers who can be taken advantage of to create something like the Bolshevik Revolution or the rise of Nazism, the rise of similar statist, nationalist, communist, socialism with power kind of systems. Mm-hmm. So one of the things he talks about in this
the
document,
rise of those things in reaction to, my read is you have on the one hand the Bolsheviks, which were in reaction to the conditions of workers of the day. Mm-hmm. But then outside of Russia, or even in the United States or Great Britain, you had the reaction to the conditions in which, in an increasingly industrialized society, workers were finding themselves, which were entirely different than what, say, their grandparents' conditions might have been, or even their parents' conditions might have been.
Right.
So it was not merely that socialism there was getting to be market demand for socialism. It wasn't like it came out of nowhere. It was market demand for socialism in reaction to what one might call predation of capitalism without regard to the moral obligations that one man may have to another. Is that fair to say?
That is 100% fair to say. I mean, if we look at the document, the third paragraph, he says, in any case, we clearly see, and on this there is general agreement, that some opportune remedy must be found quickly for the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class. For the ancient working men's guilds were abolished in the last century, so the guilds being one of these mediating societies or organizations, and no other protective organization took their place. Public institutions and the laws set aside the ancient religion. Hence, by degrees, it has come to pass that working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. The mischief has been increased by rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the church, is nevertheless under a different guise, both like injustice, still practiced by covetous and grasping men. To this must be added that the hiring of labor and the conduct of trade are concentrated in the hands of comparatively few, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. You take that paragraph totally out of context of what comes next, where he explains that the individual has a right to private property, and socialism's attempted solution fails and is inherently unjust. You can read that and you can say, "Wow, this is this document almost sounds kind of red," right? Which is of course,
totally, yeah.
Which is of course not what he's actually saying.
An excerpt, you would have to take that soundbite, because in the context of the entire thing, he's not saying that at all.
No, what he wants to say is these are the conditions that set up the attractiveness for socialism. Mm-hmm. And then he moves on to say, here's why socialism doesn't work and is unjust. And he wants to go on and say private property is a right that naturally exists. And this is the first time we hear any speak of like natural rights. Like natural right theory is more of something that comes out of the enclosure movement, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Also, like very new, a couple centuries earlier. But
did you say this is the first time we've heard the church
the church talks about natural rights, because typically the church is talking in terms of duties. Mm-hmm. Now, the flip side of duties is rights, but it is not like the kind of classical liberal derivation of natural rights that we would see, say, through Locke or Hobbes. It is a different kind of derivation, but he does want to say that private property exists. It belongs to man and his family for a specific end. And that property, that private property, the section from St. Thomas Aquinas you quoted, for example, when we opened up, lays the groundwork for a theory in Catholic social teaching that we would call the universal destination of goods. Again, I would emphasize that this isn't something that's just invented by Pope Leo in 1891 or even by Thomas Aquinas, 800, 700 years earlier. It's something that goes back to scripture. You find in the earliest church fathers like St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil the Great, that property exists for the good of man. It is not an unlimited right, but it is a right. And private property exists for that man's good, for building the family and for servicing the ends of the family. Now, those are going to largely be spiritual ends, of course, that the church is talking about. And he does want to say, the church is one of these mediating organizations. It has the opportunity and the ability to build mutual aid organizations. This is right around the same time you see the founding of the Knights of Columbus, for example, which are a good example from here in the States. Leo XIII's relationship with the United States is an interesting thing to talk about.
Where's he from originally?
He is Italian. It's funny. You read his documents. He seems to have a very Italian view of the French, which is to say, like, views the French as largely can be a headache at times, right? But he has this document called Across the Ocean, Oceana Logenqui, I think, where he talks about the United States is a fascinating area because it has all this fertile ground for the building of these mediating institutions, for churches and hospitals and monasteries and workers' guilds or unions or something. Mutual aid organizations like the Knights of Columbus would be an example to come out at this time. Knights of Columbus is founded in New Haven, Connecticut by Michael McGivney, for example. But he does want to caution, too, against some ideas that are often associated with the United States, that like the church is a democracy, right? Because he also wants to push back against the infiltration of liberalism as a contemporary concept. But he views this kind of rich, fertile ground for the creation of these mediating institutions as a generally positive thing. And in Rerum Novarum, he says, what can workers do? What can the church do? Well, workers, they do have an obligation to fulfill their duties at work within the bounds of the duties that the employer has to them. So the employer should not put them in work that is unbecoming to, their state in life, or so like children shouldn't be put in certain kinds of working conditions. Women shouldn't be put in certain kind of working conditions. The church does have a concept of a just wage. He does say that there is some element of like a wage has to be negotiated between employer and the employee, but that a wage.
To articulate that, because that was a big theme throughout Rerum Novarum. Like, it's essentially a just wage to him. I think I wrote this down. Probably have a quote. I think I'm paraphrasing. It's any wage at which a frugal person can't reasonably support himself and a family is an unfair wage.
Any wage at which he cannot do that would be an unfair wage, right? Yeah. Which then, if we're reading this today, that would present some like civil rights law questions that would be fairly difficult to navigate with. But he wants to say that a head of household should be able to frugally support the family on the wage that that person is working. He is really the first that lays that out. But even 100 years later, John Paul II reiterates that in his commemoration document for Rerum Novarum Centesimus Annus. So he says, yes, this would be section 43. Wages, we are told, are regulated by free consent, and therefore the employer, when he pays what was agreed upon, has done his part and seemingly is not called upon to do anything beyond. The only way, it is said, in which injustice might occur would be if the master refused to pay the whole of the wages, or if the workman should not complete the work undertaken. In such cases, the public authority should intervene to see that each obtains his due, but not under other circumstances. To this kind of argument, a fair-minded man will not easily or entirely assent. It is not complete, for there are important considerations which it leaves out of account altogether. And he goes on to say that there underlies a dictate of natural justice more imperious and ancient than any bargain between man and man, namely that wages ought not be insufficient to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner. If through necessity or fear of a worse evil, the workman accept harder conditions because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice.
And by that he means an employer is capitalizing on a worker's difficult situation for their benefit and behaving in a parasitical.
I mean, we can take a contemporary example here to tie this back to tech and the current economy we're in, right? You and I are recording this in early January. Last week, there was a viral post on Twitter that DoorDash has claimed is fake, that is not accurate. But somebody had made a post saying that they're an engineer at DoorDash and that DoorDash has internal to the company a desperation score for drivers to be able to say this driver will take a lower paying delivery. They have a history of taking lower paying deliveries, so just give them all the low paying deliveries because they'll just take whatever low hanging fruit are in front of them. Don't send them the high paying things when you could send the high paying things to drivers that will otherwise be waiting around for work all day. Mm-hmm. And whether or not the DoorDash as a company actually does this, like I said, the executives of the company have denied that they do this. This would be an example of, even though it's not a wage, something very similar to what Leo XIII is talking about, that he would say that is unjust. And that driver in that case is a victim of the employer taking advantage of their desperation.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to limit these duties that he outlines just to one side of the equation, because he actually goes on at great length too to talk about the duties and obligations of the worker to their employers as well. And as I recall, I should have written some of these things down. But as you said just a bit ago, to show up and do the work in a workmanlike manner. And he also, am I correct in remembering that he encourages them to organize, but also to peacefully advance their, if they have grievances, to peaceably doing them. And and I think he says as much that resorting to violence would be foregoing their duties. Is that
That's
right?
correct. Yeah, he does say that.
And I feel like he was very much seeing the simmering discontent among workers and their likelihood of resorting to violence and trying to stem that tide and keep that from happening. And both on the one hand, calling employers, and I think really we're talking about, for the most part, industrial scale employers to consider the conditions of employment. And on the other hand, he is calling to the workers in those situations to hold on to their humanity and civility in whatever protests they have.
That's right. I mean, he is, again, he's speaking from the perspective of the church, right? The Pope is the visible head of the Catholic Church, the visible head of the Christian Church would be the claim. He wants to say, like, one of the notes I have when I look through this document that I have in the margins here is that all are one in Christ, right? He wants to step aside of this idea that we are naturally in a conflict as classes, and he also that goes for both sides of the equation. The employer goes for the state, but also goes for the worker. He encourages workers to organize. He encourages workers to set up something like a contemporary working men's guild, but also tells them that you cannot resort to violence out of the desperation in which you are working. So I have this all are one in Christ margin note for myself here, section 25, where he says, if Christian precepts prevail, the receptive classes will not only be united in the bonds of friendship, but also in those of brotherly love. For they will understand and feel that all men are children of the same common Father, who is God, that all have alike the same last end, which is God himself, who alone can make either men or angels absolutely and perfectly happy, that each and all are redeemed and made sons of God by Jesus Christ, the firstborn among many brethren, that the blessings of nature and the gifts of grace belong to the whole human race in common, and that none, except the unworthy, is withheld the inheritance of the kingdom of heaven. If sons, heirs also, heirs indeed of God, and co-heirs with Christ. Such is the scheme of duties and of rights, which is shown forth in the world by the gospel. Would it not seem that where society penetrated with ideas like these, strife might quickly cease? He says elsewhere in the document that capital and labor need each other. So he wants them to work together, right? Mm-hmm. There are duties and obligations both for the worker as well as for capital. Now, that being said, when he's talking about the duties of the state, he lays out a number of conditions. Like I said, reasonable taxation, law should reflect the ability for people to own productive property. But one of the concepts we get out of here that we see reiterated elsewhere in Catholic social teaching is what's called the preferential option for the poor. So we see this under Section 37. Rights must be religiously respected wherever they exist, and it is the duty of the public authority to prevent and to punish injury and to protect everyone in the possession of his own will, everyone in the possession of his own. Still, when there is question of defending the rights of individuals, the poor and badly off have a claim to special consideration. Richer class have many ways of shielding themselves and stand less in need of help from the state, whereas the mass of the poor have no resources of their own to fall back upon and must chiefly depend on the assistance of the state. And it is for this reason that wage earners, since they mostly belong to the mass of the needy, should be especially cared for and protected by the government.
The term "should" there, maybe I have a broader comment or question about that. I feel like Leo throughout, he distinguishes between one's legal rights and one's moral obligations, and is challenging capitalists to, he is on the one hand affirming one's rights, the capitalist rights to maximize their profit. and at the same time calling them to be mindful of their duty to provide great working conditions, and suggesting that if they fail in the latter, they will, which is their moral obligation, then they will lose the former. Then that will result in them losing the former, which is their rights to property. How do you feel about that? Is that a good
I think that's directionally right. Again, we find in the tradition, if you look to Chrysostom and Basil the Great, for example, who are early church fathers in modern day Turkey, they make a very strong claim along those lines that essentially, if you could help, like if there is, often the example that they turn back to is the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, in which Christ tells this parable of the rich man who is throwing a party, and Lazarus is this beggar at his gate. The dogs come and lick his sores, and Lazarus gives them absolutely nothing out of his alms, right, out of his excess. Lazarus dies. He goes to what is essentially hell, and he asks, the rich man dies, and he goes to hell, and he asks Lazarus to help him, and he's told, you had your reward in your life, you were able to enjoy it then, right? And this becomes a very strong obligation to help the poor that you see through a lot of Christian teaching. The extent to which what we would call the magisterium, which is the teaching office of the church under the Pope, endorses something like that you would lose the legal right to own your property if you do not help the poor out of your excess, is one of these things that we don't really put the finger on. But there are sections in this document where Leo points to something like that, right? So this would be in section 22. He says, "True, no one is commanded to distribute to others that which is required for his own needs and those of his household, nor even to give away what is reasonably required to keep up becomingly his condition in life. For no one ought to live other than becomingly." That's a quotation to Thomas Aquinas. But when what necessity demands has been supplied, and when standing fairly taken thought for, it becomes a duty to give the indigent out of what remains over. Quote, "Of that which remaineth, give alms." And that quotes the Gospel of Luke. It is a duty, not of justice, save in extreme cases. So this is an important distinction going to your question, Geoff. It is a duty not of justice, but of Christian charity, a duty not enforced by human law, right? So he wants to say, you have a duty to give alms, to give to the poor, right? But that is a duty of charity, not a duty of justice. And it is duties of justice that the state enforces. But the laws and judgments of men must yield place to the laws and judgments of Christ, the true God, who in many ways urges on his followers the practice of almsgiving. It is more blessed to give than to receive, which is a quotation of the Acts of the Apostles. He says, to sum up, then, what has been said, whoever has received from the divine bounty a large share of temporal blessings, whether they be external and material or gifts of the mind, has received them for the purpose of using them for the perfecting of his own nature, and at the same time that he may employ them as a steward of God's providence for the benefit of others. Quote, he that hath a talent, said St. Gregory the Great, quote, let him see that he hide it not. He that hath abundance, let him quicken himself to mercy and generosity. He that hath art and skill, let him do his best to share the use and the utility thereof with his neighbors. So a very strong moral obligation to provide out of what one has. The extent to which the state then enforces that is something that Leo wants to say. There are mediating institutions that provide for things like that, right? Mm-hmm. The church being a great example of this. At this time, it's we're talking 2026 now, but like even within my lifetime, I remember like nuns running homes for like the sick and indigent, right? And when he's writing this, you're seeing this huge explosion of Catholic hospitals, Catholic almonries, which are a way for giving out money to the poor. Catholic schools, things like that, that are trying to provide this as a mediating institution.
Would it be? I could be projecting a bit in my reading of it. But as I read him, I felt like, let's see, how can I put this? Two things. I felt like Pope Leo XIII was a bit of a libertarian on the one hand, and on the other, I felt like he was telling all who would read this, that one cannot do good unless one has the freedom to not do good. And so that was kind of his admonishment to capitalists, industrialists, whatever term you want to use. Like, you, in order for you to be good, you must be free to do it. And so you may be prospering in a big way here, but you can't. It's a moral failing if you do it without caring for those that you can care for. Am I reading too much into that? Am I projecting a bit?
Yes and no. I would not say that he's a libertarian. Maybe for a somewhat academic reason that, libertarianism is downstream of liberalism, and he's certainly not a liberal. He has a whole document called Libertas where he goes out of his way to say essentially this negative conception of liberty that we see in kind of like the classical liberal tradition is something that he says is totally foreign to the true Christian freedom. That being said, and again, I'd underline again just to this whole talk of rights and duties and obligations. I would underline again that I do not view this, and I think it would be inaccurate to view this document in Catholic socialist teaching in general as ideological, right? So he is laying out an anthropological and then philosophical explanation for how society works and man's relationship to each other and to God. Now, that being said, if we take libertarian to mean more broadly something like what you might call like distributist or localist or something like that, I do think he is very sympathetic to that. And the distributist tradition, G.K. Chesterton, Hilaire Belloc, for example, they come out really out of Rerum Novarum, right? Mm-hmm. And out of the Catholic social teaching that came about at that time. You said a line in there that reminded me of a line from one of his successors, John Paul II, that is that freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. And I think that is captured, John Paul II is writing 100 years later, but I think that actually captures really well what Leo XIII is writing about when he talks about Christian freedom. Because he talks about Christian freedom in Libertas, for example, or in Immortale Dei. So yeah, he wants the state to be such that it provides the room for men to act as they ought, and then he wants men to act as they ought, right? Mm-hmm. The state needs to provide the conditions under which private property can flourish, it can be respected, men can acquire productive private property. It enforces a lot of things that we would associate with, like, say, a night watchman state from like the libertarian tradition, but he's arriving at it from like a totally different set of totally different set of observations than, say, Robert Nozick or Murray Rothbard, or even like the early 20th century libertarians might be arriving at it from.
Would you said it? The freedom to do what one ought. Is that right? Am I catching?
Freedom consists not in doing what we like, but in having the right to do what we ought. That's John Paul II. Yeah. Would
John Paul II or Pope Leo, do you think they would disagree with the notion that kind of the libertarian, kind of the non-aggression principle type thing, like one ought to? Would they agree with that as an idea that one ought to be free to do whatever they want, provided they're not abridging someone else's equal right to do the same?
Yes. Again, I think the derivation of how you would get there would be different. The area where we get into like weird territory here would be like bioethics would be a good example. The church would generally say like it would be appropriate for the church to regulate things like the distribution of pornography, right? Or the distribution of drugs, or even the distribution of contraception, right? Now, there would be, again, a slightly different derivation there. This rights talk is the Catholic tradition does not focus so much as in rights as it focuses in dignity and dignity of the human person and what that integral good and dignity of the human person looks like. When it does talk about rights, it is usually a function of the duties that one has to respect the dignity of those persons. Like I said, Rerum Novarum is, to my understanding, like really one of the first places in the tradition where you see the language of a natural right. You see something like a right to freedom of religion in the Second Vatican Council has a document on religious liberty, for example. But most of the language is going to be in terms of the dignity of the human person. So even if we go back to work, John Paul II has a document 90 years after Rerum Novarum. So he has two that commemorate Rerum Novarum. He has one 90 years after called Laborem Exercens, and he has one 100 years after called Centesimus Annus. And Laborem Exercens is his document really on the dignity of work, the dignity of labor. And he has this big, long derivation on that work would have existed had man not sinned. There is work in the Garden of Eden, and that work is good, right? And even after man sins and we have the fall, there's still a distinction between work and toil, right? By working by the sweat of one's brow. And he wants to say that there is dignity in this work. The workers have the right to, within reason, to organize for that dignity. Capital has to respect that. He's largely writing, again, we have to think about the context of the time here. He's writing in 1981. It's still the Cold War. It's still not obvious that the Soviet Union is going to collapse in 1981, right? And he wants to be able, a big project of John Paul II is to remove the moral legitimacy of the Soviet Union in the eyes of the people who are living under its yoke. Laborem Exercens comes in Centesimus Annus comes in 91, which is much more concerned about, is much more speaking to those in positions of business and capital. So he's got a line in that document, for example, on that it is always a moral and cultural choice where one invests. He says, in this regard, it is not a matter of the duty of charity alone, that is, the duty to give from one's abundance and sometimes even out of one's needs in order to provide what is essential for the life of a poor person. I'm referring to the fact that even the decision to invest in one place rather than another, one productive sector rather than another, is always a moral and cultural choice. Given the utter necessity of certain economic conditions and of political stability, the decision to invest, that is, to offer people an opportunity to make good use of their own labor, that's his definition of investment. I think that's very interesting, right? He defines investment as to offer people an opportunity to make good use of their labor, is also determined by an attitude of human sympathy and trust in providence, which reveal the human quality of the person making such investments. So that document's much more written to, you're doing the investment, you're working in a more investment-oriented kind of landscape. Laborem Exercens is much more written to workers. I think it, just to cap this off, I think it is, generally speaking, the church is going to, the church is going to arrive to some similar conclusions that, say, one working from something like the non-aggression principle or some libertarian derivation will be working towards. It's going to arrive at it through very different means. And there will be some cases where they'll arrive at like totally different conclusions. I think it is often you'll see the mistake where people will take, again, like the excerpt we read earlier from the very beginning of Rerum Novarum, and try to like retcon onto the church's teaching some sort of ideology.
Yeah, right.
So we see this in the 20th century with the rise of the rise of liberation theology, right? Like liberation theology ends up taking a lot of theological language, but putting on it kind of like a Marxist, socialist, quite frankly, at certain times, communist lens for what then the social action ought to be taken from it. But it's a total misapplication of the church's teaching. And John Paul II, big part of his pontificate was correcting liberation theologists who had gone too far in this regard. It would also be inaccurate to take, say, the teaching on the respect for private property and say something like that the church would endorse full-blown. I don't think the church would endorse gambling apps, right? Like, let's just take a modern application. I don't think the church would endorse gambling apps.
Would it be one thing to say they wouldn't endorse it? Would they endorse making it? Well, I guess "they" is kind of a big term, but would they endorse making it illegal? Or would they even endorse the state making laws about it one way or the other? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good area for clarification. Sometimes you'll hear that the church, like the church's charism is not to talk on policy. I've heard this from like some economists that you and I probably both know, right? And they'll hear like, Pope Francis or Pope Leo talk about something and say like, oh, well, we don't have to listen to that because he's not an economist. It's not his charism. That's inaccurate. The church has said numerous times that the church has as a function of its teaching office, it can talk about these issues. Now, what it also has said, now we can go the other way too far. We can go too far the other way and say that the church should be saying like what the marginal tax rate should be. And that's not the case. That would also be inaccurate. So specific policy, the church tends to turn away from, particularly from like the papal magisterial teaching office. Like whether one should vote this way or that way on like tax policy or the specific way of regulating a certain good. What it does lay out is it lays out moral principles that can be used for actors who have certain duties or obligations, right? So me as an investor, I may have a set of certain duties or obligations that somebody who's not an investor might have, right? If I were a statesman, a good example of this would be in like abortion, the regulation of abortion. If I were a statesman, I might have a different set of obligations, additional obligations that, Zach, not the statesman, might not have. So, for example, John Paul II has a teaching document called The Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae, where he's very clear the church should work towards the banning of abortion, right? But if you are a legislator who is given the opportunity to severely limit abortion but not ban it, it would not be wrong for you to vote in favor of severely limiting it, right? So there's certain conditions that it lays out for thinking through these problems. Whether or not it would say like we should ban gambling, like we should ban gambling apps outright, I'm not aware of any teaching that would say that per se. Leo XIV, just like a week or two ago, did have an address where he decried the rise of gambling culture to the extent that it has arisen. But if we look again through like the principles that the tradition uses, right? Like the tradition isn't just going to invent a principle out of thin air, right? That's one of the things about how Catholic moral theology might differ from a different moral tradition. It's not just going to invent a principle out of thin air. Usually there's going to be something that you're going to pull it from. Catholics have never said that even gambling is a sin, right? If we want to look at we have to answer theologically before we can answer politically, right? Gambling to excess would be a sin. Drinking is not typically considered a sin. Drinking to excess would be. There are people who are in certain states in their life, for example, the Code of Canon Law, the law that would regulate, say, priests or bishops, the internal functions of the church, I think in the late 19th century, did say that like priests should not be gambling because it gives the wrong impression to people who like they're walking by like the coffee shop and they see a priest in his clericals, playing poker with someone. That has the wrong impression. But that does not say that like somebody as a lay person should not gamble. I think one could make a case for it would be the appropriate role of a certain legislative body to heavily regulate gambling within a polity. I don't know if that would be like Congress. Ideally, that's done on like the city level, right? Subsidiarity, again, is one of the principles we would look back to here. And there's not obvious to me. Now, again, I think gambling apps kind of introduces a slightly different layer on this, but it's not obvious to me that Washington, D.C. should be regulating the specific business activities within reason, again, that might be going on in, say, like Asheville, North Carolina.
Yeah, right. Well, this is a good segue to the modern day. We've talked about a little bit about the relevancies today. Some things that I think about. We have a consumer economy today. You touch on that with gambling apps. We also have a hyper-financialization of assets, where people. I liked what you said. We have a moral and cultural choice. It is a moral and cultural choice where one invests. Mm-hmm. We also have an enormous number of people who are invested in all kinds of things that they actually don't even really think about. They're just invested in them. And we have operators, we have investors, we have employees who have a fiduciary obligation to their employer to maximize the value of the investment, which can put them at odds with their moral commitment to care for a worker's dignity, or to attune themselves to a worker's dignity. And we have a lot. These are things that, in 1600, one was not presented with these sort of dilemmas on a regular basis. The average person didn't. But nowadays, like, you might not even know it, but you could own a very, very tiny percentage of some sort of mining operation in Central Africa that has children working in conditions that you would never abide, but you're invested in that. We're sort of all participating in this, these moral and cultural choices without knowing about it, without thinking about it. And it was that dilemma of modernity that got me really curious about this topic in this writing. And you, in the seat that you were in, you're informing decisions about how investments should be made, and you're paying a great deal of attention to technology, which is the bulk of y'all's focus. And so, I don't know. I'm stating a question or an issue, and I'm asking how do you think about it, or how would Leo or John Paul II think about its application to today?
Yeah, the topic of hyper-financialization is one that, thankfully we have seen teaching from the popes on. Benedict XVI has a encyclical. He only had a few. He wasn't pope for all that long. But a lot of the stuff John Paul II wrote, for example, Benedict XVI, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, would have contributed to, because he was the head of the doctrinal office under John Paul II. So you get elements of what he is thinking in these documents as well. But he has a document called Charity and Truth, Caritas and Veritate, that specifically talks about the financialization question. So I want to point to the fact that this continues in this Catholic social tradition to be a relevant topic, as you noted. The reality of the landscape shifts in such a way that it's not obvious. How do you take these principles from like the 16th century and apply them today? How do you develop them, right? How do you take those principles and understand them. And certainly less obvious in many cases how you take these principles from like the 1st or 2nd century, right? Mm-hmm. There's a great quotation in Caritas in Veritate from paragraph 65. I'll read real quickly, and then I can move to like maybe a more nuts and bolts kind of overview. So he says, finance, and this is Benedict XVI speaking, finance, therefore, through the renewed structures and operating methods that have to be designed after its misuse, which wreaked such havoc on the real economy, must go back to being an instrument directed towards development and wealth creation of the best kind. The entire economy and finance, not just certain sectors, must be used in an ethical way for the good of all. This is not just a matter of morality, but of the optimal functioning of the economic cycle itself. He goes on to say, financiers must rediscover the genuine ethical foundation of their activity, so as not to abuse the sophisticated instruments which can serve to betray the interests of savers. Right intention, transparency, and the search for positive results are mutually compatible, must never be detached from one another. And so he's very much aware of the hyper-financialization that we see, from really like the 1980s onward in particular. He's writing that. He would have been writing that. He was Pope between John Paul II and Francis, so he would have been writing that in the early mid-2000s. And then in Centesimus Annus, again, before somebody starts seeing, like communist red, the church does acknowledge there is a right place for profit, just as it acknowledges that there's a right place for investment, but that these things are not ends in themselves. Mm-hmm. So in Centesimus Annus, John Paul II says, in the struggle against such a system, what is being proposed as an alternative is not the socialist system, so such a system being unbridled hyper-financial capitalism. So what is being proposed is not the socialist system, which in fact turns out to be state capitalism, but rather a society of free work, of enterprise, and of participation. Such a society is not directed against the market, but demands that the market be appropriately controlled by the forces of society and by the state so as to guarantee that the basic needs of the whole of society are satisfied. The church acknowledges the legitimate role of profit as the indication that a business is functioning well. When a firm makes a profit, this means the productive factors have been properly employed and corresponding human needs have been duly satisfied. But profitability is not the only indicator of a firm's condition. It is possible for the financial accounts to be in order, yet for the people who make up the firm's most valuable asset to be humiliated and their dignity offended. Besides being morally inadmissible, this will eventually have negative repercussions on the firm's economic efficiency. In fact, the purpose of a business firm is not simply to make a profit, but it is to be found in its very existence as a community of persons who in various ways are endeavoring to satisfy their basic needs and who form a particular group at the service of the whole of society. Profit is a regulator of the life of a business, but it is not the only one. Other human and moral factors must also be considered, which, in the long term, at least equally important for the life of the business. So, a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
Jump on the second that way.
When was that written?
That second section I read was from Centesimus Annus, so that'd be 1991.
Okay, so 91. So I hear that, and I think about if you own or operate a closely held business mm-hmm. where you are the owner or the owners, and it's a relatively small group, it would seem to me to live out that way would be straightforward. Really, two things. One, to live out that way with regard to profit and your employees' dignity. It's always there are difficult questions, but you would kind of know what you're doing and you would be able to do that. A thing that I note that he didn't talk about was the welfare of the customers that it serves, which is an interesting, I imagine if asked, he would have said, "Oh yeah, that's important too." And to the point about gambling businesses or porn businesses, is it a really great business if you're causing all the people who are paying you money to suffer, even if all your workers are doing great? Maybe not. But now under a hyper-financialized era, an employee may have to choose between advancing a goal that is in a high time preference environment, an employee might have to choose, or an owner might feel, or a CEO even in a financialized company might feel fiduciary obligation to act in a predatory way in order to preserve their job.
Yeah.
And there's that. And another element we have is like, there are obviously familiar, like professional investors, but there's also like everybody, like a great many people are invested via their 401k and invested in things that are being in business that are behaving in a predatory manner.
Absolutely.
So those are sort of conundrums that I feel like emerge with scale and the modern scale of businesses that we as a society are not like, I don't know what percentage of our commerce is through a financialized business now. And by financialized, I mean a business that's not closely held, probably.
Yeah.
It's where it's like a partnership is running it. It's like a great many people. The shares might be reasonably freely traded. It might be a publicly traded business. Like, there are very different pressures applied to that business than the restaurant on the corner.
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot in your question.
Yeah, there is. I didn't even ask a question.
No. I mean, there's a lot, and there's a couple different ways we could parse this. I mean, to answer a question you did have in there, yes, he does talk about the role of the business with respect to its customers and the society that it's serving in general, right? And he in this case, John Paul II, gives the explicit example of like pornography or drugs. Selling those would be taking advantage of the consumerism of society and taking advantage of people in a similar way that Leo talks about the employer in this kind of like wage factory system taking advantage of the laborer. If we're getting into we can really get into the weeds on this. So there's a whole within the moral theology. There's a whole teaching on what we'd call cooperation with evil. And this is most fleshed out actually in the bioethics. But the same principles apply in any kind of action. So again, I am not a theologian, but the intention and the act both matter in Catholic moral theology. So if I have an evil intention, even if I don't get the thing done that I start acting towards, I am acting evilly, right? Mm-hmm. So my intention matters, and then what I'm doing matters. There's some things. There's a big document from John Paul II. There's a big shift, right? The Leo encyclicals are nice because they can be like 10 pages long. By the time you get to John Paul II, they're actual books, and they're still an encyclical. But there's a big moral theology encyclical from John Paul II called The Splendor of Truth, Veritatis Splendor, where he wants to underline traditional Catholic moral theology, where he wants to say there are some things that are inherently evil. It does not matter what your intention is. We are not consequentialists. We are not utilitarians. There's some things that are inherently evil. No matter what your intention is, it is not ever morally permissible for you to do them. So like an example of this might be in the investing world. I mean, I think like you can't ever invest in like a company that builds abortion machines. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't care what your intention is. If they're building a machine that the end of that machine is an inherently evil act, which the Catholic Church would say that is an inherently evil act. I don't care what your intentions are. Now, the gravity of like your moral culpability to it can be in a different. There are like different degrees of that. So like sorry, excuse me.
It's a spectrum, I guess.
Yeah, it's a spectrum. Like, grandma investing in her, 401k, and there's a share held by one of the mutual funds she owns of Playboy even, right? Like the moral culpability that she would have would be very different than if, me as a venture investor, I go out and I invest in a pornography company, right? Mm-hmm. Those are very different things. And we can explain even like the degrees of those. And even in the grandma example, she probably doesn't even know, right? So it's like, well, let's say she knows and she's choosing to buy, Playboy in the stock market. because it gets her really good returns versus, buying the local grocery store that's publicly traded, right? Okay, well, that's still wrong. It's going to be, again, a different degree than the investor who's providing the actual direct means that the company is then going to use, right? There's also a question here of speculation. John Paul II has a condemnation of the use of property for economic speculation. And there are some theologians, like actual theologians, who would make the argument that using any property purely for speculative reasons, you just want to hold it, do nothing to improve it, make money on it, and then sell it, that's an impermissible use of property, because property has an end, right? Property's end is the betterment of those who own it, and just holding on to it, like we can imagine with land. If you have a plot of land next to your club and someone's just holding on to it, not improving it at all because they just want to make a bunch of money on it, there seems to be something off about that. Now, again, we would say, does that mean that the church would say that that person should be forbidden from owning that land? Those are separate questions, right? But might they be acting in a way that would be considered unethical? Perhaps.
It's a bit of a kind of a free rider problem there.
Yeah, right. So like you could design the property tax law in such a way, for example, that it might prevent something like that. That might be a application of the moral theology applied here, right? Like a policy application. So yeah, there's a couple. The cooperate. There's like two ways you can think about this in my mind. There's the like cut and dry, like, am I doing something evil, right? And it is never permissible to intentionally choose an evil act. Like you may choose something that has a negative outcome, but your intention is something else. That's called the doctrine of double effect. So again, with bioethics, the example here might be there might be a pregnant woman who might have a tumor that requires surgery or chemo or something, that in getting the surgery or the chemo, you run the risk of killing the fetus, right? That is morally different than an abortion. The target there is the health and welfare of the mother. Like the actual end is the health and welfare of the mother. And no matter the language that might be put on abortion, the target of abortion, the moral end of the act of abortion is the killing of the fetus, right? Those are different things. But like the investor, what are the investor's ends? Are they trying, and how much are they actually contributing to the thing that is being done? So there's the cooperation with evil question, which I think is an interesting question. And there's not a lot of good literature on it from the investor perspective. There's a lot of it in bioethics, which makes sense. The Catholic Church runs and ran a bunch of hospitals. A lot of biomedical researchers are Catholics historically. There's some decent stuff on it from like the legal perspective, which again makes sense. It's a lot of lawyers are Catholics. But then there's also just the question of like, okay, do I want to build virtue, right? There's almost more like the virtue ethics kind of take on it. Like, what is the virtuous act that I ought to take to grow in virtue, both for myself and for the small area of world around me that I can act on. So it's kind of like the negative and the positive. I don't want to actively do evil. It is never right to do evil, so good may come. And I also want to grow in virtue. An example we might take here again from the bioethics literature that we could probably apply in the investment world would be something like, there are some drugs, there's some biomedical research that requires cell lines from abortions in how that research is done, fetal cell lines, right? The most prominent of these would be HEK293, human embryonic kidney cell 293. And if you are a head researcher who is intentionally choosing to do research using these cells, you have an obligation when you discover that you're using these cells to no longer do that research, right? But if you are, say, a junior researcher who's working under that researcher, you now have to balance that against a couple of different things. One of those things you might have to balance against is, providing for your family. So the aspiring retiree has to think, okay, what are my alternative investments I could make to this? And does it outweigh the very distant cooperation with evil I might be engaging in if I we'll take an even grayer example. Like if I own Lockheed Martin stock, right?
Yeah.
Let's say I own Lockheed Martin stock. And like Lockheed Martin, obviously their products are used for lots of evil things, but it's not entirely clear that one would say that that is like an inherently evil company. Like one could have an argument about that. I think that is an interesting argument that one could have. But let's say you believe that their products are being used for evil ends. But you also can't violate your conscience when your conscience is not leading you into error, into explicit error. You then have to think, okay, I'm going to divest. What am I using the proceeds for? And what are my other options that I can put this into? Mm-hmm. If it turns out that your only other options are things where you are even closer to the illicit act, you may not have an obligation to divest in that case. Or if you're super distant from the act that may be illicit, and you're using the funds for your retirement, you have to think like, again, what else could I put this into? And is my retirement a good end? Mm-hmm. This is not consequentialism, but it is something that we have to think about in terms of how do I weigh the obligations and duties I might have? The important detail is like me as an investor, like I've had this conversation with people where I would, like I said, I'd never invest in a company that's making an abortion machine. I would recuse myself from that at the very least, right? I would never invest in a company that is, I'll give you an example. There was an article earlier last year called Zombie Bioethics in First Things that was about researchers that are trying to develop a way that you could take a human embryo, you could genetically edit that human embryo in such a way that it will grow without a brain. Mm-hmm. It'll still grow all the organs, but it will not grow a forebrain. You would essentially give this embryo anencephaly. Now, I think if you do an analysis of that, first of all, it should strike anybody as deeply weird.
Yeah.
But if you actually like dig into like, okay, well, what's the intention and the act? What is going on here? You are intentionally creating a deformed human. Whether you want to use the language human being, human person, I think you actually don't even have to. I don't even think you even have to actually answer that question. And so to intentionally create a deformed human is something that is deeply disrespectful of human dignity. And an investor who intentionally gives money to contribute to that would be, knowingly that is what it is, and that is the moral weight that is carried there, would be acting illicitly. Like I would never agree to sign up for that. But it might make good money.
It may be legal to do.
It might be legal to do.
Do it.
One of the things, quite frankly, one of the things in the time that I've been working in this space is we've seen a shift from investors being meaning investors in funds, LPs, not wanting anything to do with like defense tech to being very excited about defense tech. And there are like lots of reasons for that. I think there are lots of reasons for why that LP appetite has shifted. Some of those are political reasons. A lot of those are political reasons. Some of them are economic reasons. We're seeing more and more funds that are very excited and happy and willing to invest in essentially pornography or things that are downstream of pornography. So, and to what you noted earlier, individuals follow incentives, right? Mm-hmm. So, an investor who's investing someone else's money, they're going to follow the incentive of trying to make profit for that person. What can somebody do? Okay, well, I'm going to sidestep the policy question because I'm not a policymaker, and I think going to the subsidiarity point, I think there are very few situations where this would be solved by like a law passed by Congress. There are probably some. I'm probably willing to endorse more than you might be willing to endorse, but there are relatively few. I think the first thing people can do is they can put their foot down. Investors can put their foot down, and then the professional investors can, like LPs, people investing in the funds, and then professional investors can put their foot down. If you're in the stock market, okay, what can you do? You're just like grandma investing on Main Street. It's a very small thing. It's a tiny, tiny drop in a very, very big bucket. But yeah, choose not to invest in those things.
Yeah.
And I think at a certain point, you have to be willing to eat, like, yeah, I might make lower returns investing in something else versus investing in Playboy, right? Mm-hmm. It's a constant weighing of these duties and obligations.
It is, well, something that I'm heartened by, and I think you've drawn my attention to it in the past on X, but I've been in technology for, in some form or fashion for almost a little over 20 years. And something that I've noticed lately, maybe I've just been paying attention to it or looking for it more, is people in the venture capital world have moved away from the idea that, anything, and not that they were ever explicitly on this, but anything that can be done ought to be done. And there's plenty of technology. I think you made some examples that that investors are starting, or influential investors who have really, really broad reach are saying like, I don't think that's right. Like, we're not going to invest in things like that. As an example, the zombie thing from First Things would be an example for that. Whereas, I don't know, like, seems like 15 years ago, everybody was focused on crushing it and getting as big as possible. And it really didn't matter what the social media platform did actually, or the manner in which it did it, or it's the moral foundation it was built on. Those things didn't matter as much to you. Fake it till you make it, whatever it takes to get there. It seems to me to be less of that now. And you've been in this for over a decade, right? Maybe,
It's about a little bit over a decade. On the venture side, it's about 7 or 8 years.
Have you sensed a tone shift, like a shift in the zeitgeist in your industry on that? Or is it just the same as it's always been?
I think it depends.
I'll give some specific examples.
Yeah.
I feel like Peter Thiel is regularly talking about these issues, like the moral consequence of our actions, whatever his motivations may be there. Or Mark Andreessen is talking about these things. Like, influential investors are talking about the moral consequences of our investments. Whether or not you agree with their assessments of them, people are talking about these things. And I don't recall that being the case 15 or 20 years ago.
I think where I am most optimistic is actually on the founder side. I think we're seeing a bit of a split.
Yeah.
And I think I was just having this conversation with a professor friend of mine the other night with respect to like Gen Z. I think the way that Gen Z, but I think we see this among founders of different generations as well, they tend to either be like total financial nihilists, where it's like, I don't care what I'm doing, I just need to get rich, right? Mm. And I do think there is a lot of that. And I think we tend to see like the most cartoonish forms of it in things that are essentially gambling apps or in companion apps, using AI to like have an AI girlfriend, something like that, right? So they're either like total financial nihilists, they don't really care, they just want to make a lot of money. Or they're totally in, like they believe something very strongly, right? So they either believe nothing or they believe everything, right? That seems to be the distribution that I'm finding among like the younger founders I interact with, but even founders, that we say like are solidly millennial. So like I will give an example. There was a prominent VC who, since we are on the topic of Rerum Novarum and like Catholic social teaching, and I went in a bit of a crash course on some elements of Catholic moral theology. So for those yeoman listeners who might not be interested in that, thank you for bearing with us. The Pope, this Leo XIV, has been very outspoken on AI. He has yet to have like a very definitive teaching or document come out on this topic, but he seems to the very least, what he's saying is like, you gotta be responsible in how you use this stuff, right? Which is, the bare minimum you'd expect from the Pope. I think he's holding his cards close to the chest, and I think there will be stronger teaching on this coming this year. But there was a prominent investor who retweeted the Pope's account with a dismissive meme, right? And he got completely dragged, mostly by founders.
Yeah,
I know a founder who, for example, like totally ratioed him, right? Meaning like retweeted him and told him like it's a really bad look to be, mocking the Pope on this topic, and he deleted the tweet. Which, I mean, wow. But the general consensus among like the founders largely was like, yeah, this is not a good look for investors, right? So I mean, whether or not the respect to like, do investors care about where they're investing or not? I think it depends on the vertical. When I started working in this space, there were many fewer people who were willing to do defense tech investments. And I think defense tech, you and I have had some offline conversations on this stuff, right? I think defense tech is one of these areas where there's a lot of conversations to be had. And even within it, there's a distinction between you're building software that might be used by like the VA or even by like the Department of War to do like CRM stuff versus you're building actual bombs, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's a spectrum even there, right?
And probably too, like you're building actual bombs, but when are you building the bombs and what's the geopolitical climate and for what reasons are you building the bombs?
Yeah, for whom are you building the bombs? Like what do you expect them to be used on? I mean, again, the intention and act matter here. Yeah. Like I would say, I don't think like building a weapon is an inherent, with some exceptions, I would maybe say that building a nuclear weapon is an inherently evil act. A weapon that is designed to target an innocent population, that would be an evil act. But like building even a drone, I would not say that's inherently evil. But then you'd have to look like, okay, well, what is the intention of that drone, right? Like what is the use of that drone? But we have generally seen like people are more willing to do defense tech investments. There's more investments in sex tech. So I think in a certain sense, people are more willing to work in areas where they weren't willing to work before, but maybe they put a layer of like meaning on top of it, right? They say like, well, I'm doing this for like this strong meaning rather than like financial nihilism. On the founder side, I think it's either like they have very strong meaning or they're just financial nihilists. And that I think is downstream of COVID. That I think is downstream of. I don't think it predates
that. I kind of feel like Gen Z. I guess Gen Z, that was a defining time for Gen Z in a really big way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some element of that, but I think it's COVID, being hyper online, a bunch of things like that, I think drive the financial nihilism you see there. And financial nihilism is not my own phrase. Luke Burgess on X has tweeted about this a lot, and I think Luke's largely right on this stuff. What I would, as we think about wrapping up here, I realize that in a certain sense, this provides really interesting fodder if you're interested in these questions. In another sense, it doesn't provide like clear cut, like we should pass this law, you should do this thing, you should always act in this way kind of answers. I think there are principles. And those principles go back to a set of conditions of like who we want to be. Like, do we want to be virtuous, or do we want to be slaves, right? And the actions for a specific individual to either be free and virtuous or vicious and a slave are going to be different based on where they are. Mm-hmm. There are principles we can work with that we can learn from. I would like, if I'm talking to a founder and the founder is thinking about building two different things, one just to make a ton of money, and the other, it will make money, make a lot of money even, but there is some like communion of persons involved in it, right? I will encourage them. They should probably work on the latter. Where I am is going to be a different set of questions that I'll need to ask versus say where you might be as a founder and maybe as an investor who's in a different area of the space. And where we are both is going to be different than a mutual fund manager versus somebody buying that mutual fund. Mm-hmm. But we have to ask like who do we want to be, and what do we want that society that we're in, our family, our neighborhood, our city, to look like. And that's all going to be downstream of our actions.
Yeah.
The older I get, the less I'm convinced that there's just like a fix everything button, and it's just like people need to convert, and I mean that in the sense of like what conversion means, which is like a turning away from, right?
Mm-hmm.
They need to turn away from what the world is pushing them into right now, I'm explicit about my own. Like, I also think they should convert to Catholicism, but I'm willing to work with others who are pushing people in the right direction.
Zak, I really appreciate you speaking with me today. Where can people find you? I mostly interact with you occasionally in really delightful ways like this, or in conversation or face to face, but probably mostly via X. But would you please share where people can?
Yeah, I'm on X at Z Slayback. They can also email me, zslayback@gmail.com. Those are probably the two main places. Also on LinkedIn. I'm on all the platforms everyone's required to be on nowadays.
Well, I've really loved speaking with you about this topic. I think it's a really important one, and it's great to be mindful of that conversion and turning and being intentional with our lives. Thank you, Zak Slayback. Thank you all for joining us on Yeoman.
Thank you, Geoff.